The wind arrives first, screaming across the northern sea like a living thing, clawing at the land with invisible fingers. It howls through the fjords, slams into rock, tears spray from the waves, and hurls ice-hard rain sideways through the air. In this place, storms do not ask permission. They come to break, to freeze, to erase. And yet standing against this fury there are homes. Not ruins. Not collapsed heaps of timber. Homes that remain upright, warm, and whole, long after weaker structures would have surrendered. How is that possible? How did people with no steel nails, no concrete, no modern machines, build shelters that storms could not destroy? To understand the answer, you must forget everything you think you know about strength. Strength, in the Viking world, was never about rigidity. It was never about resisting nature head-on. These people lived where the earth itself seemed hostile, where winter swallowed the sun, where trees grew slowly and grudgingly, where the sea fed and threatened in equal measure. Every mistake was punished. Every weak idea was erased by wind, snow, or fire. Survival here was not accidental, it was engineered. But this story does not begin with a hammer or a plank of wood. It begins with fear. Imagine standing on a headland as the sky darkens in minutes, not hours. Clouds stack like black mountains. The sea below turns violent, its surface shattered into white scars. You know what is coming because you have seen it before. Roofs torn away. Walls crushed inward by snow. Fires suffocated by icy drafts. In this world, a failed house is not an inconvenience, it is a death sentence. Children freeze. Elders do not wake. Food spoils. Life ends quietly in the dark. So the question becomes urgent, almost desperate: how do you build something that refuses to fail? The Vikings answered this question not once, but over generations. Their solutions were not written in books. They were carved into memory, whispered from father to son, from mother to daughter, tested by storms that killed the careless and spared the wise. Every beam, every joint, every stone had a purpose. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was wasted. Their homes were not built quickly. They were thought into existence. And here is the first secret most people never consider: Viking homes were not objects placed on the land, they were negotiations with it. Before a single log was cut, the ground itself was studied. Wind patterns were watched across seasons. Snow-drift paths were memorized. The angle of the sun, low and weak in winter, mattered as much as the fury of the gales. A house placed 10 steps too far uphill might be crushed by sliding snow. A doorway facing the wrong direction could invite lethal drafts inside. In a world without nails or cement, placement was the first line of defense. This is where modern thinking fails. Today, we force buildings onto land. The Vikings did the opposite. They listened. They watched how grass bent under winter winds. They noted where animals chose to sleep when storms arrived. They observed where snow melted first and where it lingered longest. The land spoke, and those who understood its language lived longer. Those who did not, vanished from memory. Once the site was chosen, another question followed, quieter but just as dangerous: how do you make wood stronger than metal? The answer was not found in force, but in connection. Viking builders understood something modern engineers had to rediscover centuries later: that flexibility is not weakness. When storms strike, rigid structures snap. Flexible ones move, absorb, survive. So instead of locking wood together with nails that would rust, loosen, or split timber, they shaped wood to hold itself. Logs were not merely stacked. They were interlocked. Cut with precision using simple tools, each beam was carved to cradle the next. Corners were locked using complex joints that tightened under pressure. When the wind pushed, the house did not fight, it leaned slightly, redistributed the force, and settled back into place. The storm spent its rage. The house remained. Think about that for a moment. a building designed to cooperate with a storm. No cement hardened into brittle mass. No iron spikes created stress fractures. Just wood, shaped with understanding, patience, and respect for how materials behave when pushed to their limits. These joints did more than hold walls together, they allowed the structure to breathe. As temperatures plunged, wood contracted without tearing itself apart. As moisture swelled the fibers, the joints tightened rather than failed. This was not accidental genius. It was survival refined into craft. But walls alone cannot stop a storm. The true enemy of the north was not just wind, it was cold. A cold that crept silently into bones, into breath, into hope. And here the Vikings revealed another layer of brilliance, insulation born from the land itself. Their homes were thick not in appearance, but in intention. Walls were layered with turf, packed earth, moss, and stone. Grass roofs were not primitive guesses, they were calculated shields. Turf trapped heat. Snow, instead of being an enemy, became an ally, settling on roofs and forming an insulating blanket that locked warmth inside. Inside these homes, fire burned steadily. Smoke curled upward, not wasted, but guided. Heat was retained, shared, slowed. Even during the worst winters, when the world outside froze solid, these interiors remained livable. Not comfortable by modern standards, but survivable. And in this land, survivable was everything. Yet storms do not only come from above. The ground itself shifts, freezes, expands, and cracks stone. So Viking builders refused to anchor their homes in ways that invited destruction. Foundations were flexible, layered, forgiving. Stones were placed to distribute weight, not lock it in place. When frost heaved the earth, the house adjusted rather than shattered. Every choice carried the same philosophy: do not resist nature. Understand it. Use it. And still, none of this explains the most unsettling truth of all. Many of these homes outlived the people who built them. Long after the last fire went cold, long after voices faded, the structures remained. They endured storms meant to erase them. They waited through centuries, silent witnesses to a knowledge we forgot and are only now beginning to admire again. So ask yourself, what kind of minds create buildings like this? What kind of world forces such intelligence into existence? Because these were not peaceful farmers gently experimenting with architecture. These were people who expected hardship as a rule, not an exception. Their engineering was shaped by hunger, by loss, by storms that took everything from those who underestimated them. And this is only the beginning. Because as formidable as Viking homes were, their true brilliance lies deeper, hidden in the way communities built together, in the rituals that guided construction, in the unspoken laws that determined whose home would stand and whose would fall. There are decisions they made that modern builders still struggle to understand. Choices that seem counterintuitive, until you see the storm through Viking eyes. The question is no longer how they built without nails or cement. The question is, what else did they know that we've forgotten? And once you uncover that answer, you will never look at a primitive home the same way again. To truly understand how these homes endured, you must step away from the structure itself and look at the living force behind it. Because no Viking home was ever the work of a single pair of hands. In a land where winter could kill in silence and storms could erase years of labor in a single night, isolation was weakness. Survival demanded unity. And architecture, for the Vikings, was a social act as much as an engineering one. When a home was planned, the entire settlement knew. Not because of ceremony or celebration, but because everyone's life depended on the success of that structure. A poorly built house did not just endanger its occupants, it became a liability to the community. A collapsed roof meant frozen bodies to care for. A failed hearth meant hunger spreading beyond one family. In this world, craftsmanship was not admired, it was required. Knowledge flowed without books, without drawings, without measurements written on parchment. It lived in memory, in repetition, in correction. Older builders watched silently as younger hands worked. Mistakes were not scolded, they were stopped. A joint cut at the wrong angle was not good enough. It was redone. Time spent correcting errors was cheaper than lives lost later. This collective discipline produced something remarkable: consistency. Viking homes across vast distances shared the same core principles. The same roof angles. The same wall thickness. The same understanding of how snow would slide, how wind would wrap around corners, how smoke would behave inside confined spaces. This was not coincidence. It was the result of a culture that treated building as inherited wisdom, not personal expression. And here lies a chilling truth: innovation was dangerous. In modern thinking, progress comes from bold experimentation. For the Vikings, reckless change meant death. New ideas were tested slowly, cautiously, often on storage buildings or animal shelters before ever being trusted with human lives. Only when a design survived multiple winters did it earn acceptance. The storm was the final judge, and it never showed mercy. This is why Viking homes feel timeless. They are not frozen in history, they are distilled survival. Inside these homes, space was shared with intention. Families lived close together, not out of affection alone, but because shared body heat mattered. The central hearth was not a convenience, it was the heart of existence. Its position was calculated to distribute warmth evenly, to prevent drafts, to keep smoke moving without suffocating those inside. Children slept closest to heat. Elders were placed where warmth lingered longest. Even sleeping arrangements were acts of thermal strategy. Every detail served a purpose. Doors were low not to humble visitors, but to trap heat. Ceilings were close not to oppress, but to concentrate warmth. Windows were small, often covered with animal membranes, letting in light without inviting the cold. Nothing was accidental. Comfort was sacrificed so survival could be guaranteed. And yet, these homes were not joyless shelters. They were alive with sound. The crackle of fire. The rhythm of tools. Voices telling stories while storms screamed outside. In these moments, architecture became more than protection, it became psychological armor. A well-built home did not just stop the wind, it calmed the mind. It allowed people to sleep while chaos raged beyond the walls. That sense of security was as vital as food or warmth. But storms test more than walls. They test time. Wood rots. Turf shifts. Earth settles. And the Vikings understood that no structure remains perfect forever. So maintenance was woven into life itself. Roofs were inspected every season. Turf was replaced. Beams were adjusted. This constant care prevented catastrophic failure. A small problem fixed early never became a deadly one later. Modern buildings are often abandoned to decay until collapse. Viking homes were tended, like living beings. Neglect was not ignorance, it was negligence, and it carried consequences. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all is this: Viking builders did not believe their homes were permanent. They believed they were temporary victories against nature. That belief shaped everything. It kept arrogance at bay. It encouraged humility, vigilance, and respect for forces beyond human control. And yet, despite this humility, their homes endured longer than anyone expected. Storm after storm came. Generations passed. Empires rose and fell. But many of these structures, or their foundations, their patterns, their knowledge remained. They whisper a lesson we struggle to relearn today: that true resilience is not about overpowering the environment, but aligning with it so completely that destruction has nowhere to take hold. Still, we have not reached the heart of the mystery. Because there was one final element that made Viking homes nearly unbreakable, something invisible, something modern engineering rarely accounts for, something that turned ordinary materials into extraordinary defenses. And once you understand that final element, the storms of the north will no longer seem like the enemy they once were. The answer lies not in wood, turf, or stone, but in an invisible balance the Vikings mastered long before the language of physics existed. A balance between pressure and release. Between weight and movement. Between chaos and control. This was the quiet intelligence at the core of their storm-resistant homes, and it is here that their engineering becomes almost unsettling in its precision. The Vikings understood pressure intimately. Wind did not simply push, it surged. It hunted for weakness. A crack, a corner, a sharp edge where force could concentrate and tear everything apart. Modern structures often present these targets proudly: flat walls, rigid angles, seal joints that hold firm until the moment they fail catastrophically. Viking homes offered no such invitation. Their shapes were deliberate. Roofs sloped steeply, not for beauty, but to deny snow the chance to accumulate and crush from above. Walls were slightly angled inward, guiding wind up and over rather than allowing it to slam directly into the structure. Corners were reinforced not by stiffness, but by geometry: curved transitions, overlapping layers, and joints that redirected force sideways instead of absorbing it head-on. In storms of terrifying strength, the wind did not fight these homes. It flowed around them. Inside, the pressure was equally managed. Gaps were intentional. Openings were controlled. A home that is perfectly sealed becomes a trap under pressure, vulnerable to sudden collapse. Viking builders allowed air to move slowly through the structure, relieving stress before it could build to destructive levels. What seems like imperfection to modern eyes was, in truth, calculated breathing. And this breathing extended to fire. The hearth, that constant companion of life in the north, was both danger and salvation. Smoke could kill as easily as cold. But the Vikings learned to shape airflow so smoke escaped while warmth stayed behind. Roof openings were angled and sheltered. The rising heat pulled smoke upward, creating a natural draft that refreshed the air without chilling the room. Even in storms, when wind tried to force itself inside, the system adapted: pressure equalized, flow reversed gently, disaster avoided. This was not luck. It was mastery earned through loss. Every burned home, every suffocated family, every frozen winter taught brutal lessons. And those lessons were absorbed into design until survival became predictable. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this invisible engineering was how it responded to time itself. Materials age. Wood dries, cracks, shifts. Earth settles unevenly. Turf decomposes and must be renewed. Viking builders expected this. They designed homes that could change without failing. Joints loosened and tightened naturally. Roofs sagged slightly without collapsing. Walls absorbed movement instead of resisting it. In essence, Viking homes were designed to forgive themselves. This forgiveness extended even to catastrophe. When a section failed, it often failed partially, not completely. A roof beam might shift without bringing down the entire structure. A wall might bow without splitting. These partial failures bought time to repair, to survive, to endure. Modern disasters are often sudden and total. Viking disasters were slow, survivable, reparable. And then there is the most haunting realization of all: these builders did not think in years or decades. They thought in lifetimes. A home was built knowing it would shelter children not yet born, knowing it would be repaired by hands not yet taught, knowing it would be judged by storms no one could predict. This long vision shaped every decision. Shortcuts were rare. Cheap solutions were unacceptable. The storm was always coming, even if the sky was clear today. But the final layer of their invisible defense lies deeper still, embedded in belief. The Vikings did not separate the physical from the spiritual. A home was not just timber and earth, it was a boundary between order and chaos. Construction was often accompanied by rituals, offerings, and symbolic acts meant to invite protection and ward off destruction. Whether or not these rituals had physical power is irrelevant. What mattered was the mindset they created: a seriousness, a reverence for the task, and understanding that building a home was an act of defiance against forces that could not be fully controlled. This mindset produced focus, precision, care. When people believe their lives truly depend on every cut, every placement, every decision, the result is excellence born of necessity. And yet, for all this wisdom, for all this invisible brilliance, Viking homes were still tested relentlessly. There were storms so fierce they seemed determined to erase human presence entirely. Nights when the wind screamed like an angry god, when walls groaned, when fires flickered, when families waited in silence, listening for the sound that meant failure. It is in those moments when everything hangs on the decisions made years earlier that the true genius of Viking engineering revealed itself. And still, we have not reached the storm that would push these homes to their absolute limits. Because there came a time when nature unleashed forces so violent, so prolonged, that even the most resilient designs were forced to reveal their final secret, one that transformed homes into fortresses of survival. And when that secret is uncovered, the line between engineering and instinct disappears entirely. This was the moment Viking homes were truly designed for. Not the sudden, dramatic blast of a single storm, but the relentless siege of nature that followed. The kind of weather that did not roar and vanish, but stayed. Pressed. Waited. Tested every weakness until something gave or someone did. In these long assaults, the greatest danger was not collapse. It was exhaustion. Cold seeps differently when it has time. It creeps into joints, into lungs, into morale. Food runs low. Firewood dwindles. Repair becomes impossible. A home that merely stands is not enough, it must sustain life when hope thins to almost nothing. Here, Viking engineering reveals its most ruthless intelligence. Their homes were compact by design. Space was limited not because of scarcity, but strategy. Smaller interiors required less heat. Less heat required less fuel. Less fuel meant survival stretched further into the winter. This brutal efficiency was the difference between life and death when storms trapped families indoors for weeks. Walls layered with earth and turf did more than insulate, they stabilized temperature. During brief thaws, they slowed melting. During sudden freezes, they released stored warmth gradually. The home became a thermal reservoir, absorbing and releasing energy in quiet balance with the environment. Inside, everything had a place. Storage was built into walls. Tools hung where moisture could not claim them. Food was kept where cold preserved without freezing solid. Even waste was managed carefully, because sickness during a long storm was often fatal. Cleanliness, order, and structure were not comforts, they were defenses. And then there was silence. In the worst storms, conversation stopped. Not from fear, but from conservation. Breath itself felt precious. People listened to the wind, to the roof, to the fire. Every creak told a story. Every groan warned of stress. Viking homes spoke to their inhabitants, and those who knew how to listen survived longer. This intimacy between people and structure created a feedback loop. When something shifted, it was felt immediately. When turf loosened, when a beam settled, it was noticed. Small adjustments were made even during storms, packed earth pressed back into place, supports wedged tighter, fires fed carefully to prevent smoke reversal. The house was not a shell. It was a partner. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of these prolonged storms was the role of darkness. In winter, daylight barely existed. Storm clouds erased what little light remained. Inside Viking homes, fire became the sun. Its position, its size, its management determined mental survival as much as physical warmth. Too large, and oxygen vanished. Too small, and cold claimed the weak. Generations refined this balance. Fire pits were shaped to radiate heat outward, not upward. Stone reflected warmth back into the room. Ash was preserved as insulation. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be spared. And still, storms demanded sacrifice. Animals were sometimes brought inside, sharing warmth and breath. This was not sentiment, it was survival mathematics. Bodies generate heat. Heat preserves life. The smell, the noise, the discomfort were accepted without complaint. Pride had no place in a winter that could kill without warning. In these moments, Viking homes transformed into ecosystems. Humans, animals, fire, earth, and wood existed in fragile harmony. Remove one element, and the system failed. Yet even in this extreme endurance, there was preparation for the worst possible outcome. Viking builders planned for partial loss. If a roof section collapsed, it could be isolated. If one wall failed, the rest could hold. Sleeping areas were positioned away from structural weak points. Exits were kept accessible, even under snow, because escape, however desperate, was sometimes the only option. This willingness to face failure without denial was perhaps their greatest strength. They did not assume perfection. They assumed adversity. And then, when the storm finally loosened its grip, when wind softened, when silence returned, the true test began. Because survival did not end with endurance. It continued with recovery. Homes were inspected. Damage was assessed. Repairs began immediately. No rest. No celebration. Nature had retreated, but it would return. And the next storm would remember every weakness left unattended. This relentless cycle shaped a people who were both hardened and humble. They did not conquer storms. They outlasted them. And yet, there is still one final revelation left, one that ties together every beam, every ritual, every whispered lesson passed through generations. A realization that explains why, even today, modern engineers stand in awe of structures built without nails or cement. Because the true marvel of Viking storm-resistant homes was never just how they were built, but why they were built that way at all. This is the final question that unlocks everything. Viking storm-resistant homes were not built merely to survive weather. They were built to survive time. Not as monuments, not as symbols of power, but as vessels of continuity, bridges between generations in a world where death was common and certainty was rare. Every home carried the weight of memory, responsibility, and expectation. And that purpose shaped every beam more powerfully than any nail ever could. In the Viking mind, a home was never owned outright. It was borrowed from ancestors who had refined its design, and from descendants who would one day depend on it. This belief changed how people built. When your work will shelter children you will never meet, shortcuts become unthinkable. Care becomes instinct. Precision becomes moral. This is why Viking engineering feels almost eerily modern. They were not building for appearance or status. They were building systems. Systems that could be understood, repaired, adapted, and passed on. A son did not inherit just a house, he inherited knowledge of how it worked. Where it bent. Where it breathed. Where it might fail if neglected. The house taught him, the way it had taught his father. This generational intelligence created something far stronger than cement, continuity of understanding. When a beam creaked, it was not a mystery. When turf sagged, it was expected. Nothing was hidden behind finished walls. Everything was visible, accessible, honest. Modern buildings conceal their weaknesses until they become disasters. Viking homes revealed theirs early, quietly, and forgivably. And here lies the greatest irony of all. The Vikings are remembered as warriors, raiders, destroyers, men who burned other people's homes. Yet in their own world, they were among the most careful builders of shelter humanity has ever known. They understood destruction intimately, which is why they feared it at home. A man who knew how easily fire could erase a village did not treat construction lightly. Violence sharpened their respect for stability. This respect extended beyond survival into identity. A home was where stories were told, laws were spoken, alliances were formed, and children learned what kind of people they were meant to become. If the home failed, culture failed with it. So architecture became a silent guardian of values. That is why Viking homes feel so purposeful. They were not just responses to storms, they were responses to existence itself. And storms were teachers. Every winter refined their methods. Every collapse, every near miss, every loss sharpened judgment. Knowledge was paid for in suffering, and once earned, it was protected fiercely. That knowledge spread slowly, carefully, until it became tradition. Tradition became instinct. Instinct became architecture. By the time nails and cement arrived centuries later, something had already been lost. Not the tools but the mindset. Modern building often assumes rescue. Vikings assumed none. They assumed the storm would come. That help would not. That preparation was the only mercy available. This assumption stripped away fantasy and forced truth. What remains when everything unnecessary is removed? Only what works. That is why their homes endured. Not because Vikings were stronger than nature, but because they were honest about it. They did not believe storms could be defeated. They believed storms could be understood. And in that understanding, they found a kind of peace, a way to live without illusion, without arrogance, without dependence on fragile certainty. So when you look at a Viking home, low, heavy, rooted in earth, you are not seeing primitive architecture. You are seeing humility shaped into shelter. You are seeing fear refined into wisdom. You are seeing survival elevated into philosophy. And that is the true engineering marvel. Not that they built storm-resistant homes without nails or cement, but that they built them with something far rarer: acceptance, patience, and respect for forces larger than themselves. And once you understand that, the wind no longer sounds like an enemy. It sounds like a reminder.